Stella, Zoe, thank you very much. Of all the voices that might speak kindly about the book, it's yours that I treasure the most. That is young hearts and minds, especially those that encounter this book in a classroom. And the reason for that is that the book is not really a book of ideas. It's a mirror woven through stories, through which we might see ourselves more clearly, for the purpose of being present in the world in a particular kind of way. So it's not an easy thing to read. And in fact, it would be an easy thing to be annoyed by and at times offended, possibly. So let's get to the crux of it, maybe. You want to make a difference? How do you do that? And if you were asking me that question, this would be my answer. Notice. That's it. Notice. And when you notice, you'll come to ask a question. And when you ask a question, possibly a good question, then there is an opportunity that you might follow where that question leads. And that's it. That's all there is. It's as simple and as complex as that. But before we go any further, that's actually really, really hard. Mainly because to be able to notice, you have to have your stuff together. If you don't have your stuff together, you won't notice because it's really hard. Your own stuff sits right in front of you. So by the way, there's lots of ways of saying that. If you were Jordan Peterson, you'd say it like this. You'd say, get your own house in order before you speak out of whatever might lie beyond. Or Jesus would say it comically, take that flogging great big log out of your own eye before you might try and remove the speck from another. Or Gandhi would say, you may well wish to see a change in the world, please do, but be it first. So getting our stuff together. If we were to have our stuff together, you would notice that we ask maybe one of the most important questions all the time. In fact, every day. Could it be more beautiful, wonderful, simple as, how are you? And if you have your stuff together, you would notice that that's not just a greeting, but a question. If we don't, you'll miss that. But if we do have our stuff together, you might then be awake to the answer that comes, which from a person who is not okay, may well in your presence feel free to speak honestly. I'm not okay. And in that place, a whole new possibility opens up, just because you've got your stuff together and you've asked not just a greeting, but a really good question. 7-year-old Chelsea lived in Qatar with her parents. And as she hopped into a 7-seated Land Cruiser with her father, because that's where he was working at the time, she noticed that just beside, a bus was being packed with a whole bunch of brown people. 7-year-old Chelsea asked, why? 17-year-old Chelsea is in this room tonight. And whilst she hasn't quite got all her stuff together, she is in a better place to follow that question and where it might lead. 15-year-old Greta was in a classroom sometime, and her stuff was sufficiently together to listen to a science teacher speaking about science that's over 130 years old, about when you burn stuff, where carbon goes and what happens when carbon collects in the atmosphere. And it then functions like a blanket and traps heat. And when you notice that, you can then ask a question. What do you do about that? And what's going to happen when that heat keeps being collected? And that Greta has had her stuff sufficiently together to annoy a lot of other people, but simply to follow where that question leads. You might notice that it's really hard to wear a face mask and that it's annoying. and that being under a curfew, even a lockdown, is hard. But if you can notice that, maybe you could also notice that there are some people who've been doing something far, far worse now for their 8th year. They're called refugees and they're under Australian care. But if you don't notice, we won't ask questions like, how is it possible for us to treat people so intentionally badly and abandon all care for their human rights? And when our stuff is kind of together, we might dare to wonder and follow where that question would lead. You might be awake to notice that this land wasn't empty. It had hundreds of nations, of peoples and culture that had been here for tens of thousands of years. And when we are able to be awake to that, and also then be awake to black people die in custody in Australia, and then ask a question, and have the courage and capacity to follow where it leads. Why? How long does that have to go on for? When could that stop? Or maybe the most simplest noticing of all, we're extraordinarily privileged, aren't we? Maybe all of us here and watching at home, maybe, profoundly privileged. And when we notice that, there would come a question, shouldn't there be? What do we do with that? How are we to live with what we know? The answer to that question, you've got to work out. We've all got to work out. The context for the answer of that question, a little bug called COVID makes it really obvious. Is it alive? Is it a living thing? It's just a little bundle of DNA, tiny, tiny thing, but that tiny little bundle of things has bound this whole earth together to help us to see what actually was always real in the first place. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. It's all related. Life fundamentally is relational. Reality fundamentally is relational. Problem solutions, all relational. Knowledge, truth, freedom, it's all relational. Health, economy, it's all relational. Privilege, fundamentally relational. So when we are awake and our stuff is near together, by the way, I ain't got my stuff all together. I'm profoundly grateful for the people that I live with for helping me on that continued journey. But if we were to have our stuff together, then we can follow the questions that come. About 4 years ago, I sat in a cafe with an amazing woman called Frankie Spark. She's the artist whose extraordinary work fills the pages of I Just Want to Make a Difference. And I sat across the coffee table and I told this story, and it went like this. I met an amazing young woman who's just recently come back from Cambodia, and she was speaking so eloquently about building a road for people there. And I had some questions, and I approached her afterwards. And these would have been my questions if she allowed me to ask them. How much experience have you got building roads? How many people where you live have similar skills to you? How many people in Cambodia have similar basic skills to you to be able to build a road? But I couldn't ask those questions. And the beautiful young woman just responded, I just want to make a difference. And that coffee shop, that conversation is where the book began. And to that young girl, as might be to anybody else, the question for me has been, how can you take the empathy, that drive to move beyond the self, to add and build on the good, and not fall into the traps that come with anything whose first 3 words would be, I just want. That's the root of the book. And if it's possible that you who are here and watching at home and anyone who might read this book can dare to look into the mirror and come to a place where our stuff gathers together such that we could notice what's going on around us, and in noticing what's going on, ask a question and have the courage and capacity to follow that question, that, like a little bug, is all that's needed to change everything. So to you beautiful young human beings, your hearts and minds, don't wait to grow up even. Don't wait to finish school even. Just now, right where you are, it's enough to be awake, to wonder, and to notice, and to ask a question, and to follow, dare you, where that would lead. And if this little skinny book makes a contribution to that simple, profound journey, I am privileged, and the world will be blessed. So it is a delight, and I'm deeply humbled that here we are. So thank you very much.